Matthew Walker. He's got a pretty impressive history in the trombone community, not only as a professional player, but also as a repair technician and now instrument maker of the wildly successful M&W brand of custom trombones. Matthew is in Jackson, Wisconsin, which is not quite, I guess we could argue that maybe the upper mid-Atlantic in the United States, with not too far from Elkhart, Indiana and all that, it's kind of like our Nuremberg, Germany, region that is just becoming rich in the trombone manufacturing, hub of the United States. But if you have not played an M&W instrument and you like playing excellent trombones, then the next time we do get to go to things like a conference or a festival, and there are some M&W horns there, or if you get to go to a shop and they have a couple of M&Ws, on the side, definitely pick it up and try it. They're fantastic instruments made by just a very mindful and skilled and detailed and passionate craftsman. And today we're going to get an opportunity to just hear a little bit of his story, and hopefully this will kind of put us into just a great opportunity for conversation. So, feel free to ask your questions, and Dave and I will be monitoring the chat. So if you prefer to drop a question into the chat, we'll make sure that that gets fielded, and, make sure that Matthew, is aware of that. But otherwise, this is just a great opportunity to have some fun in a trombone community. So without any further ado, I'll pass the baton over, and Matthew, you're over here today, so thanks for joining us.
Well, I think we can call it quits now. Jason said everything that I could possibly say. He's been very generous in. I've got nothing further to add. It's obvious to probably everybody here. Hi, Stuart. That I'm obviously not from around here. I'm Australian, as is my colleague Dominic, which is lovely to hear another Australian accent. And I actually grew up 5 hours northwest of Sydney in the state of New South Wales, in a little town called Dubbo, which is population that had approximately 30,000 when I was growing up. So I'm a country boy, from a small town, but moved to Sydney as a 16-year-old to finish off my high schooling at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music in Sydney, which was the sort of breeding ground for music students to continue in their academic studies, which I did start 3 years of my Bachelor of Music degree, but I did not finish that degree because I was actually very fortunate to win the position as bass trombonist with the Australian Opera and Ballet Orchestra at 21 years of age. So it was a question as to whether I continue at school and complete my degree or do the job that I'd somehow managed to win. I think at the point I was probably too stupid to realise that playing trombone was hard, and turned up to this audition and won it. I was very fortunate to do so. And that job entailed playing tenor trombone, bass trombone, contrabass trombone, all sorts of opera from Gilbert and Sullivan all the way through to Puccini, Verdi, you name it, including world premieres of some very interesting Australian pieces, where literally you'd get to the final rehearsal and there's still new music being put on your stand to play. So we ran the whole gamut from bums on seats, Gilbert and Sullivan operas to, as I say, some world premieres where we literally had 4 performances after months of rehearsals, because they knew that they weren't really going to get that big an audience. It was such an esoteric sort of thing to put on. So I did that job for 16 years. But in the process of doing that job, it was a case of obviously playing trombones and buying trombones to do that job. But over the time, it was sort of thinking, something, I'd like to change something here. And just see if that makes a difference. I had some ideas about how things could work. And so my father was a watchmaker, and he said to me, well, trombones, brass instruments, they're just soft soldered together. It's not that hard. So he taught me how to soft solder, and he and I actually put together a valve section for a trombone that I had from components that I had purchased. And I took that to work and played on it. And like everybody was like, holy wow, you can do that. It's like, well, sort of. But it then progressed with that same valve section. I thought, you know, what if I was to change these things? And in that instance, it was a case of putting on some slightly heavier slide tubes just on the valve section. And so I had the tubes and I swapped them out and took the thing to work again. And it was like, oh, wow, that made a difference. So that's how that sort of interest started. And it continued to the point where oftentimes I would take a completely new instrument into work to play that night. And the guys would say to me, oh, so, okay, Matt, what are you going to be bringing next time? You know, surprise us. What are you going to bring in? And how long is it going to be before we see a Matt Walker trombone? So that had always kind of been in the back of my mind, that I would like to make my own instruments somehow. I didn't know how that was going to happen, but it ended up that in the process of sort of fiddling around with instruments, I decided, okay, if I'm going to learn how to do this properly, if I'm going to do this, I need to learn how to do it properly. So I came over to Red Wing in Minnesota in 1998 and learnt musical instrument repair. It was a 9-month course, very intense, but incredibly valuable for learning the processes involved in repairing instruments. Went back to Australia, went back to my orchestra job and started up an instrument repair business, which actually got to the point where I was booked out 6 months in advance just for service work, just for keeping horns playing. But also in the process of that, you know, I was installing axial flow valves and buying valves from Ed Thayer, which, as it turned out, I was actually very fortunate to go and spend a week with Ed and Barb Thayer in their home in Oregon in 1999 after I'd finished at Red Wing, and got to have a look around his museum of artifacts, essentially, and talk to him about his developments and things like that. It was a fascinating time, wonderful time. So coming back to Australia with the job, installing axial flow valves, Ed was no longer in a position to be able to do that. He had a legal injunction against him. So I went shopping and bought pretty much any sort of valve that I could find on the market, which led to buying Greenhoe valves, which that then eventually led to being offered a job to come and work for Greenhoe. And the offer was made, you know, what would it take to come and get you to come and work here? And I said, well, I'd be needing this much. And the response was, well, we could do that. So I said, all right. So I came over and interviewed for 4 weeks. I can't recall when that was. It was a long time ago. It's ancient history. And decided that, yeah, that was what I wanted to do. So organised the work visa to come and work as a foreign national, as an Australian citizen, to come and work for Greenhoe, which I did for 6.5 years. That company closed 6.5 years later, which meant that basically I was in a situation of needing to leave the country because I was still on a work visa. I was engaged at the time to my now wife, and it ended up that, fortunately, the Getson company took me on as another work visa holder. So that allowed me to come back into the country and marry my wife, and which allowed me to then obtain a green card. And now finally, I've been a citizen for 1.5 years, and just voted in my first presidential election. So I didn't wear my sticker, but so doing my civic duty. So that then led to the possibility of actually starting my own business. And that's how M&W Custom Trombones came to be, that working in the Greenhoe shop, that, you know, there were 3 other techs in that shop, one of whom was Michael McLemore. And we had realised that, you know, we worked well together. We had complementary skills. And so we thought, well, you know, let's keep exercising those skills. And we started M&W. So the M in the name is for McLemore and the W is for myself, Walker. However, the and has now gone, in so much as Michael left the business at the beginning of the year. He had some pretty severe physical issues, both with carpal tunnel syndrome in his hands, and also with having to have 4 vertebrae in his back fused. And so basically the physical demands of the job it got to the point where he said, look, I can't keep doing this. So he has left the business and is involved in other employment now. But we've parted on good terms. We're still in contact. So that's where we find ourselves now, that I'm a sole tradesman, sole craftsman. As I said earlier, working with my wife pretty much every minute of the day we spend together. And it's good. I enjoy that. She enjoys it too, fortunately. So that's my history in a nutshell, just to give you an idea as to, you know, how this little venture came to be. It was something that grew out of that little kernel of an idea. Hey, Matt, when are we going to see a Matt Walker trombone? Who knew that this little kid from Dubbo in New South Wales, Australia, was going to end up living pretty much literally on the other side of the world, making trombones for a living? I never thought that would be the case. But so, yeah, if there's any comments, questions from that little history, if there's anything at all or not.
No, it's really cool. It's a really great story. Maybe you're going to cover this in another section. I'm curious to hear about your horns and like the sort of concept you have behind them, and what if it was like sort of evolved from like a particular, like sometimes people are copying more like the kind of Con Elkhart lineage of playing, or more like the German trombones, or I'm just kind of curious about how, you know, like just what you kind of aim for in sound concept and priorities for the equipment.
Sure.
But maybe you're going to talk about that already, you know.
Well, that would be an excellent lead in. Well done. So, I mean, like all trombone players, I've been down the road of trying everything out there. You know, you name it, I've bought it, I've played it, I've sold it. You know, it's been a case of trying to find, you know, the holy grail. And that sort of led me down the path of narrowing in on what made a good instrument. You know, what was the sound that I was looking for too. And at one point I was actually having a discussion on one of the online forums, and Sam Burtis had made a comment about, you know, if there's a trombone player whose sound you like, look at the gear that they play and play it. And so I thought, oh, you know, I mean, that's a bit of a duh comment. Why didn't I think of that? So at the time I was working for the opera, and I won't mention the brand, but I was playing on this particular instrument, which for all intents and purposes was what a professional bass trombone player should play. And so I thought, well, all right, I'll try this. So I bought myself a 1972 Bach 50, and I bought myself a 1969 Con 62H, and played on those horns, and it was like, oh, wow, there's something to this. That, you know, there are distinct characteristics within the instrument themselves, which it does explain, you know, why Bill Reichenbach sounds the way he does, why Charlie Vernon sounds the way he does. You know, that there are characteristics that suit the player and that the player conversely suits as well. So that was a big influence on me, that, yeah, understanding how those horns were made, and how that understanding came to be was basically just by pulling them apart. That over the time of, you know, installing axial flow valves and Hagman valves and Greenhoe valves and Rotax valves and you name it, just pulling them apart and really seeing how those things were put together and extrapolating that further into what I would like to see in an instrument. So, yeah, I mean, there's the possibility with what I'm doing of capturing almost anything that you would care to mention. But realizing, you know, because I am a small shop, I can do that, but that at the same time would also lead down an enormous rabbit hole. So it's really been a case of focusing for me on what does make a great trombone. And yeah, those characteristics that you might find in a Mount Vernon New York Bach or in an Elkhart Con are certainly characteristics that I'm striving for in every single instrument that I'm making. And those characteristics, for the most part, are based on the bell construction. So be it a one-piece bell construction with a soldered rim, like a bark, or a two-piece bell construction with a non-soldered rim, like a con. So that's where 90-some% of the personality of the instrument actually comes from, is from the bell construction. And where the rabbit hole comes in is that, for example, on a two-piece bell, the flare and the stem don't have to be the same thickness, right? So there's any number of variants where you could go just on a two-piece bell construction. It's, you know, the possibilities are endless. So really, for what I've done to this point, it's been a case of sort of narrowing in on instruments that I feel make that great classic American trombone sound that I've been looking for myself. Fortunately, a lot of people have liked that. But that's my sort of influence, if you will, as to what makes a great trombone. It's really paying homage to what has come before me. I mean, sure, I can push the boundaries in a direction that somebody would like to go, absolutely. Some of those instruments can end up very interesting and not necessarily something that I would choose. But sure, it might suit an individual, and I'm certainly happy to do that, if that helps to answer the question. Cool.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
All right. Anybody else?
I have a question maybe that follows in that same vein that
Sure.
you were just mentioning, and especially about two-piece bells where
Yep.
your flare and your stem can be different widths.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of made me think immediately, oh, all right, what's your opinion on screw bells and whether or not they should be manufactured from the ground up, or if someone says, hey, I want to convert my horn into a screw bell and they cut it. Just as a side note, I have a green hoe bass trombone and it's traveled all over the world with me, and everywhere I go, people want to buy it from me, and I say,
I remember putting that horn together too, Terry. So, you know, that's a piece of my history as well.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, it can be a bit of a crapshoot. I will say that from the perspective of what converting a bell to a screw bell does, I don't have an issue with converting a two-piece bell. I mean, if somebody was to come with an Elkhart con and say, hey, can you make my con a screw bell? I'd say, sure. I'd be very hesitant. Do you really want to do this? Because this is irreplaceable, you know. But I really wouldn't necessarily have an issue with doing that. If you had an early Elkhart bark or a Mount Vernon or a New York, I would very strenuously suggest against that, just simply because in my experience, there's a big difference in how a one-piece bell ends up playing after the conversion than the way that a two-piece bell does. Okay, that a one-piece bell, it tends to make the horn very stiff in response and a lot less flexible internally as well. It does help with louder volumes, but it tends to make softer dynamics a little bit dull. Whereas those same things don't necessarily apply to a two-piece bell. So with the instruments that I've done here, they have started out as two-piece bells, which have then had the screw ring put on and cut and modified. But there certainly would be a possibility of, you know, making other bell flares, for example, out of other materials or whatever. I've not done that yet. I mean, there's still a lot of ideas up here that have got to, you know, come out into the real world. I'm not sure when some of them may come out, but you know, that's my general take on it, is that yes, with a two-piece bell, absolutely, it really doesn't bring very many negatives with it at all. Whereas with a one-piece bell, I'm really hesitant, especially if you really like the way the bell plays. I would advise against it because it's not a positive thing with a one-piece bell, in my opinion.
Cool, thanks.
You're
I
welcome.
don't think I would ever consider cutting my bell. I'm terrified because I know exactly how that horn plays.
Yeah.
But I know I have seen other players who are just like, oh, I decided this morning that I wanted a two-piece bell. So I went down to the shop and they cut it for me. And I'm like, oh, you're crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's just interesting to hear from your technical expertise side, kind of the difference as well with the what do you say, the home construction or how the bell
Yeah.
was originally constructed too.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I mean, the benefit for you too is that you play an instrument that has a detachable bell. So you could have another bell mounted on it, you know, and in that instance, I would actually suggest you get a two-piece gold brass bell and with the screw bell, and that would you know, come pretty close in some regards to the way that instrument plays now. You know, depending on the thickness of the bell that you start with, you could go a little bit lighter because you're putting a pretty big chunk of material on the bell with the screw ring. You could come pretty close in response and sound with a screw bell to the way that horn plays, and then you wouldn't be risking that bell at all.
Cool. Does anybody here play on a screw bell? I'm wondering what you feel the difference is. Oh yeah, Jason. Okay, cool. I know I've tried one or two back in China, and I gotta say I wasn't impressed.
Yeah. Again, to a large extent, it depends on what the bell is that you start with too. Yeah, I mean, I've, if I may be so bold, I think like the instrument that Jason has, it's great. I'd be happy to play that any day. But at the same time, I'd be happy to play a non-screw version of that too. You know, it's, but yeah, I have no hesitation. I mean, Jason's instrument is a tuning in slide, double independent with M&W valves. And yeah, there's actually been a couple of those made, I think maybe half a dozen of them now, and they play great. Yeah, as I say, I'd be happy to play one all the time. No issues at all.
When are we going to call it the Solomon model?
As of now.
you could shorten it and just call it the Jason Who model.
We might put a little JS next to the engraving.
But Terry, I don't know if I'm the best person to ask because I consulted with Matthew and requested that this design be made. So from the beginning, it was a two-piece bell. Having said that, I love the way it plays, and you know, 100% of the time for me personally right now, and I don't mean to sound like I'm plugging like an infomercial, but for me personally, when there is an issue, it is because I am still developing as a player. It is not the equipment that is limiting or shifting me in a certain direction. It's just, there are things I need to practice, you know, basically, but the instrument has been just, you know, wonderful to play.
Thank you.
I think that's really important to say that horn was designed from the ground up to be specifically a screw bell. That plays a lot of difference in there. It just, it breaks my heart so much. My husband's a trumpet player, and he's really big into American vintage horns. And it breaks my heart so much to see him work really hard to set someone up with a fantastic horn, and then they go and they do something crazy to it. And I've seen that so much in China. It's like, look, I have this 1970s Bach 50, and I cut the bell, and I put this on it, and I did that. And I'm like, I'm going to beat you to death.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's something that I very much, whenever I'm working on an older instrument, and I'm actually, for Stuart, I'm working on a New York Bach 50 at the moment, refurbishing it, that everything that I approach, I'm trying to keep the instrument as authentic as possible and be the least invasive as possible as well. I mean, it's sometimes difficult to not be invasive if you've got a traditional wrap valve section, for example, with dents in the crook. The only way you can get at it is to pull it apart, literally pull it apart and take the dents out and put it back together. So obviously that's being invasive, but nowhere near as invasive as cutting a vintage bark bell and making it a screw, that's sad. I mean, I realise that if that instrument is owned by somebody, that's theirs to do with, and good luck to them. But yeah, it's unfortunate when people learn the hard way.
You know, not to get too far down the rabbit hole of screw bells, but I do have kind of a question / maybe a conversation starter about it. And this is something that I didn't know. I was quite naive in this process, but when we were talking, I learned a 2-piece bell, which comes with, we'll just say this piece and that piece.
Yep.
When you get a screw bell, the point where those 2 bells meet is not the junction point that the screw actually goes. You actually
ideally
a 2-piece bell.
Yeah.
And so like on mine, I can see that there is kind of a I don't know if it's a welding line or like a junction line, a synanthroidal joint, if you will, that is not where the ring is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like the bell had to be constructed completely and then cut, and then a screw was added on.
Yes.
Now, why is that? Just because there is kind of a gold standard, no pun intended, of size of screw part, or are there other considerations as to why that is the location that the junction? Because I just assumed it would be piece A and piece B, and we'll put a screw in the middle, and then boom, you got your bell. But that's not really how it is.
That was based on experimentation that I did. You know, there's been a lot of scrap pieces of metal sitting out in the back of the shop that, you know, where experiments have been done, and, you know, realizing that, okay, that's not the desirable end result. That yes, you could make a separate throat and a separate flare. But I've found that actually starting with a bell and ensuring that junction where the stem and the flare are joined does not sit underneath the collar, that gives the best result.
For those of you that, I don't know if you can see this, but here is my bell, and right here you can see the line where the 2 pieces were connected.
Yep.
So it's not exactly where the the screw component is. I'll kind of.
So you're saying that the connection of where the 2 pieces of bell where they're joined, the screws in a different spot.
Yes.
Yeah, it's slightly off. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, which I found fascinating. I just assumed naively, because I don't build instruments for a living, that it would be the spot to put it. But
right. Well, as I say, that was based on experimentation, and making scrap. Because once you cut a bell, there's no turning back. But yeah, that's in my opinion. I need to put that caveat out there too. That in my opinion, there are people who do it other ways, and that's great. But that's the way that I prefer to do things.
Not to turn it into a forum on bell screws, a screw on bell. But it does, for people that travel and for people that fly a lot, it does make it, it's a game changer in terms of the logistics and the pragmatism of traveling, on airplanes. So do you think that the sound of the trombone that the world is used to is going to change or kind of evolve in that kind of migratory direction because more and more players are getting screw-on bells? Like, do you think that there's going to be like the 21st century concept of trombone sound? Do you think it's going to kind of shift a little toward more of a screw-on bell-ish kind of a sound?
I can't predict that. We'll just have to wait and see. For me, ultimately, I think, it's necessary that it sounds like a trombone. Rightly or wrongly, we play music which is predominantly based on traditions. Sure, there has been development and advancement of the sound that is expected to be made, but it still needs to sound like a trombone. So who knows? That's going to be interesting to watch and see what does happen in that regard. I mean, the thing that's interesting to me is that so far, I really don't know that there has been that much of a change. You know, with the increased use of screw bells, that there are a lot of guys playing them, and they don't really sound that different yet to me, to my mind, which is good as far as I'm concerned. You know, because as I say, you know, as whether it comes from our own perspective or from the audience perspective, you know, we're expected to sound like trombone players, not like a semblance of a trombone player, if that makes sense. So yeah, I don't know.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Interrupt.
No, go for it.
I was just going to say we had a question in the chat that popped up asking about when screw bells kind of started hitting the scene, and you know when they were invented, and maybe who was doing that first. Just out of curiosity, if you the background or progression of that. I joked that you know French hornists have been doing it for a long time.
Right, right.
And,
well, the earliest examples that I know of were the Holton, the Friedman model, which they were from the 60s, I believe. It was a 551 bore with a red brass bell. It was a two-piece red brass bell. Again, as it turned out, those examples that I've seen had the seam again that's slightly below the screw ring, but that was from the 60s, I think. So that's the earliest example that I'm aware of on a trombone, of a production example, was the 60s on that particular Holton.
I know that Dee Stewart, who I studied with a little bit at IU, he had a trombone with a screw bell that was around the same vintage. And the reason why he did it, or the way that he tells the story, was that when he was playing in the Philadelphia Orchestra, he would constantly get the hand, just that it was always like way too loud, way too loud, way too loud. So he asked for like another bell that was smaller that could be put onto the instrument. So he had a couple of different like size bell flares that could be added. And so when he put on the smaller bell, he was essentially playing in his mind with the same volume of sound, the same loudness, but he wouldn't get the hand, you know, nearly as often. And so he felt like that was just kind of a nice little workaround. But he's got, you know, I don't know if it was a Holton, but it came with 3 different bell flares, and
right.
It was about the same time period. But he did mention that the maker used a ring from French horns that had kind of become the standard point on a French horn where you put the screw bell. And so it seems as if that, you know, was a good starting point, because the makers literally had those parts lying around.
Right. And yes, early on that was the case. You had to use what was available. I mean, the rings that I'm using are made specifically for the bell tapers that I make. So, you know, it's a purpose-made part specifically for these bells. So yeah, that compromise is not there. Was the screw bell primarily a logistical invention due to greater ease of travel versus aesthetic? I believe I think that was probably the case, that being able to put the instrument in a flat case obviously alleviates having the big bulge on the end of the case, you know, bumping your knees and stuff like that. But being able to get it into an overhead locker, for example, is a big difference.
Well, it makes you wonder, because we don't really see it before people started flying.
Right.
And in the 60s, you know, a couple of maybe the high-end orchestras might have had flights to various places. And then now flying is, you know, ubiquitous. And so it's become a thing. But, you know,
it used to be.
asterisk, right.
Yeah.
But, you know, back when orchestras maybe used to hop onto a bus or a train and go somewhere locally, it wasn't as big of a concern. Yeah. And, you know, that's kind of changed. So I wonder if it is more of a logistical development. And then now that people are getting really good at it, you might argue that now there's there's perhaps some aesthetic, you know, trade-offs and benefits.
Yeah. Well, as I said, with that instrument of yours, for example, I'd be happy to play that every day of the week. No concerns at all. But yeah, the idea of depending on the case you have too, of trusting a non-screw bell trombone in the baggage hold of an aeroplane, man, that's a scary thought. Actually, an example of that, when I was with the opera company, they decided to buy a contrabass trombone for me to play, because we had had a conductor say that he wanted me to use a contrabass on Puccini, for example. So it ended up that they ordered, or through my consultation, we ordered a Glasl contrabass, and they sent me over to Germany to collect the instrument to bring it back, because it was actually less to buy the airline ticket than it was to pay the customs and import taxes in Australia at the time, because they were 24% sales tax on an instrument like that. So it would have cost a lot of money to be able to just import this thing, as opposed to me going there and bringing it back. And bringing the instrument back, it was in its case in a large cardboard box. And we went to the airport at Frankfurt, and the big baggage handler fellow put the box standing upright on the conveyor belt. And, you know, we signed all the documents, and he said, all right, you are good to go. And he proceeded to push the box. So this box that had this enormous contrabass trombone just fell and bounced on the conveyor belt a couple of times. And I was like, oh my God, we haven't even left the country and the thing's damaged. Fortunately, yeah, and I couldn't open it up to see if it was damaged or not. But fortunately, we get to the other end. You know, I open it up, and no damage had occurred. But I spent that entire flight, the 20-some hours from Frankfurt back to Sydney, just thinking, oh my God, I've got this broken trombone that I'm taking back to Sydney, and what am I going to do? So yeah, in that instance, if I could have gotten a screw bell contrabass trombone, it would have absolutely been the preference.
I wonder if subconsciously that contributed to your interest in learning how to fix horns. If there was that thought of like, you know, if I knew how to fix this, it wouldn't really be a problem.
It may have done. Yeah.
I actually had a question, and it's more about materials. I know that, and just since you and I have had, you know, several conversations, just to kind of a little bit of a backstory to the room. There was a time where I was interested, since it is a screw bell, in trying other bells to screw on, you know, to it. So for example, trying like a gold bell or a yellow brass bell. Mine is, would you call it red or
red brass? Yep.
Red brass, yeah. So mine's red brass. So I thought, well, what would it be like if I put on like a gold flare or a yellow flare, a silver flare, whatever. And actually, and there was a point where there was one that ended up being damaged and repaired or replaced or whatever. And so it was like it was going to be a doorstop, or you could send it to me and I could try it. And so I tried it, and I didn't like it at all, to be honest. I didn't think it worked well with the instrument. It was almost like taking two great beers that I enjoy and mixing them together. It just didn't taste good. But I know that Dallenbach from the Canadian Brass has, for decades now, at least a decade, championed the use of carbon fiber. And he's talked about it with several instruments like flutes. He has a carbon fiber tuba bell. There are carbon fiber slides, and a lot of things that he has referred to with this, you know, space age polymer material is that it's exceptionally light. It has a very quick response. It warms up, you know, almost immediately. And there's all these, you know, what he considers to be amazing benefits for carbon fiber. My question for you is, have you done any work or experimentation, or do you have any, you know, thoughts on the use of carbon fiber? Because at one point, it almost seemed like many people were saying, oh yeah, it's the material of the future. A lot of things are going to turn in this direction when they find a way to kind of bring the production costs down. I just wondered if you had thoughts on that.
I've not had any experiments myself. Thinking back to when I visited Harry Glasl, he was making fiberglass sousaphones, and he demonstrated to me that, you know, one of the benefits of fiberglass is that it's relatively indestructible. And he proceeded to take a screwdriver and smack this sousaphone that he just finished making with the handle of the screwdriver, and said, look, no damage at all. So that, of course, you know, progressing through to carbon fiber, that would obviously be the one big advantage, is that damaging it is, I mean, you can still damage carbon fiber, but it takes a lot more, you know, effort or force to damage carbon fiber than it does to damage brass. Does it play the same way as brass? As I say, I don't know. I'm not going to venture an opinion one way or the other in that regard. I could certainly see for people with physical issues, like being able to hold up an instrument, that having a much lighter weight instrument would be of benefit. Having said that, there are certainly things that can be done with conventional brass instruments to make them lighter, but still have them play in a way that you want it to. That can be done, either with devices to help you hold the horn or to simply make it lighter. That there are possibilities there. Yeah, I'm going to reserve comment. Here we've got another question.
Oh, cool.
Oh, sorry.
You answer that one. I've got a question about valves when we have a moment, but yeah, you go ahead, answer the question.
Okay. I see that there's a question about, is a two-piece bell cheaper to make than a one-piece bell? They each have their own demands, if that's the right word to put, that the way that you make a one-piece bell versus the way that you make a two-piece bell, they are similar but different. So there is more time involved in a one-piece bell with the hammering, whereas with a two-piece bell, it's predominantly spinning that's involved. I mean, hammered bells are still spun, but the hammering does take more time. So that's really the biggest difference, is just the time involved in a one-piece bell versus the two-piece bell. If that answered the question. I didn't see who asked that question, but if that answered the question, I hope so. So, Dave?
Yeah, I had a question about valves, because I studied in the United Kingdom and kind of fell in love with these old Ian Bousfield recordings with some of the earlier brass bands. And I found out recently that he didn't play a valve section until like very late in his orchestral career, and it kind of got me curious about taking the valve section off my horn, and I love it, So I've actually spent a couple of weeks on down. I think you might want to jump in this too. I've heard you mention you don't use a valve section as well that much, I think. Yeah. So it's kind of created this conundrum for me of like, how do I get that sound of a straight horn? But then, of course, sometimes you need to play seventh position and stuff like that, which then becomes really hard, So I was just kind of curious, like, I don't know if you could just talk about valve construction, if you ever found a solution for that, or something like valves that will actually be able to get that kind of sound of a straight neck pipe, but still have that.
Yeah. Well, the unavoidable, and this kind of relates to carbon fiber too, to some extent, that the unavoidable fact is that when you put a piece of metal on an instrument anywhere, it's going to make a difference. So, with bass trombones, for example, you might start out with a single valve bass trombone, and it'll play a certain way. If you put a drop-in second valve, so in the F attachment, it will actually not change the way the horn plays a great deal, but it does have the added advantage of the second valve. If you then put that second valve as a dependent, yes, it moves that next step further, away from the single valve as it started out. And then you drop that second valve down onto the main neck pipe, and it moves that next step further away again. The big kicker with that, though, is how much of an influence does the valve type have, right? So you can start, depending on the valve, the change between a straight instrument and a double independent instrument may not necessarily be as large as it might be with another type of valve. Okay, so that it really is a question of what type of valve that you're talking about as well. That there are some valves that do have much more of an influence on how the instrument plays than other valves.
Okay. Yeah, I think what I'm kind of starting to realize is that, like, you have like the one factor is like, how much does the airflow change on the valve? So if it's like going straight through, or if it's like an axial flow valve, or it's doing something different like that, that's the one factor. But then the other factor is just the weight of that and if the bell responds a bit differently. Because when I took the net pipe off, I felt it wasn't just about the air going through. It was something about how that whole section sort of vibrated. I could feel it vibrating differently. And
Right.
so I guess that's kind of the conundrum for me of like how to, you know, and you listen to like these old, because the thing is like Ian played like so much stuff in the LSO, and he did it all in a straight horn. So it's clearly possible, but I don't know how.
Dennis Wick before him too.
Oh, right. Yeah.
You know, yeah. It's a personal choice in that regard. I mean, certainly a lot of first trombone players, I'm sure, could get away without a valve at all. You know, so it's a personal choice thing. If I would have my druthers, I'd play a straight trombone every day too. I'd love playing straight trombones just for the quick response, and just the ease of blowing them. I mean, my preference would be as a bass trombone player to play a single valve bass trombone. You know, just for various reasons. I'm not smart enough, you know, to keep all those second valve independent combinations in my head all the time. I think that's part of it too, though. But it's all personal preference. But yeah, as I say, it does come down to the valve choice too, that, you know, the difference between a trombone without a valve and a trombone with an axial flow valve, for example. I mean, or even to go even further, a Bach K valve or something like the old, what were they? I can't recall the name now. They didn't last very long, but the Miller valve, they were a big chunk of metal, you know. So the realization that, as you say, when you're playing the instrument, it vibrates differently. And the realization there too is that, like I said, when you put a piece of material on an instrument, it's going to make a difference, right? And it's not because the instrument needs to be resonated to make the sound, okay? I mean, it's the vibration of the air column within the instrument that makes the sound, okay? The difference comes in, it's because the parts of the instrument that it's made from are resonant. And in the process of you blowing into the horn and inducing that energy, inducing the vibration in the air column in the horn, that is inducing the parts of the instrument to resonate, okay? And they are absorbing the energy that you are putting in. So that's probably the biggest kicker, is finding a valve which absorbs the least amount of that energy, okay? That's where the difference comes in.
Okay, I get it. That makes sense.
And that's why lightweight bells play different to heavyweight bells, because a lightweight bell absorbs and holds less of the energy that you're putting in than a heavyweight bell does. Right? And that applies to every single component on the horn.
Wow. That's cool. So in terms of like, because I'm still using a heavyweight slide, which I'm not sure if that's a good combination or not. I haven't worked that out. But what are your thoughts on lightweight slide versus heavyweight slide and how that factors into all of it?
What is it that you play?
It's a Shires. It's actually I used to play Con Elkhart 88H, which I still have. That was in the UK. Okay. And then I went to when I ventured for a while, I played the Shires, their Elkhart copy. Yep. And then I just recently swapped the bell out to their the 7 light. It's his sort of it's a 2-piece bell, but it's like sort of a hybrid 2-piece bell. He does something different with it. But it's the 7YLW. So it's yeah. But I still got the lightweight, the heavyweight slide. I don't know if that's might need to change also.
Right. There is no right or wrong. If it works for you, it works for you. Okay. I mean, and that may be getting around the answer, but for my personal take, I don't see anything wrong with a heavy slide, because that, in my opinion, helps to keep the energy in the sound and traveling through the horn into the bell section. Whereas in theory, to my mind, a lightweight slide, it tends to dissipate more sound around you and move a little bit less of the energy through to the bell section. But that's a very sweeping statement. You know, there are things that can happen elsewhere in the instrument to help counter those influences. You know, so, I mean, you go a long way in one direction, like a tuning in slide horn is a very heavy slide, and that can be countered by the fact that the bell has less bracing, and generally a lighter weight bell flare works very well. Whereas if you put a heavyweight bell on a heavy slide, that's a tank of a thing to try and blow. But some people that's the right instrument for them. You know, so as I say, there's no right or wrong. If it works for you, that's all that matters.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, I feel with a heavyweight slide, it definitely goes more, but then it attacks a little slower. And then you've got like the slide technique becomes harder, you know? So it's sort of like you're sort of just exchanging problems at some point, you know? But also like, but that's interesting. We talk about like the transferring the energy of the vibration to different parts of the instrument. I never really thought about that, but that makes a lot of sense. Yeah,
and that all comes down to the design of the instrument. You know, that's all of that thought. You know, with these horns that, you know, I started with literally with a clean sheet of paper and a pencil and a ruler and a calculator and ideas, and designed them from the ground up. Designed the tooling to make the parts. And that was when, you know, the thickness of the valve section tubing, you know, how thick should that be, for example, those questions came into play. And every single component was considered in that regard. So yeah, it's a very wide-ranging question that you ask. And it really depends on what the player is looking for, what the designer is looking for, what the manufacturer is looking for. You know, yeah, it's a very wide open-ended question. I did see that there was, has that got you answered, do you think? Or?
Oh yeah, that's great. I mean, I think I was just, just very curious to hear your thoughts about that. That's really helpful. Thank you.
It's probably unfortunately made you think, I need to go and buy a couple more bells or a different slide.
No, I just had another one. We don't have to have a discussion with this, but just kind of throw it out there. I see tuba players with like a sort of valve they press to adjust the tuning slide. Like, I wonder if that's possible, because one of the things is like getting out quickly to 7th. I don't know if maybe it's a whole different rabbit hole we don't have to go down, but I just had this idea, like, what if that's another design idea, you know? Because euphoniums do it, and you know.
Right.
Anyway, there was a question I think in the chat. Oh, go ahead.
I know the argument that most people use about trombones is that we've got the world's biggest tuning slide right here.
Right. Yeah. That's the thing. Yeah, you're right.
So, it's just a question of whether these actually.
It would really just be for short people like me, because you know, getting out there, it could be nice to have just a little bit more, you know, slide length, you know. But okay.
So you could get one of those sack butt hand grips. You know,
I thought about that too. I actually really did. You know, but then that would change. I don't know.
It would change everything.
Maybe I should just practice more. Really.
Hey, but you know, Nikki Abisi has actually just come out with her little grip that allows longer reach on the slide. You know, that's a very elegant solution to that. I don't. What's that called? It's the extender bone.
I didn't know that. I'll check that.
That's a horrible name.
Because it only.
Love the idea, but.
Like, it only comes up in a few situations. That's the thing. Right, especially if you're playing first trombone. It's like, and really theoretically, it would just be easier to put the valve on for that show. You know, just say, okay, if you're gonna do Legazo Wadra, just put the valve on, and then, you know, next week take it off. You know, but I don't know.
I think to some extent, yes, the necessity becomes the mother of invention, and if it's as simple as just putting the valve back on the horn for that particular show. Yeah, that's the thing that makes sense. I did see a question come up asking about a dent in a bell and if that would make a difference to the way the instrument plays. It depends on the dent. If it's something that's just a little tiny ping dent, you know, from like putting the trombone on the stand and you miss a little bit and you end up with a little bit of a bump in the bell, I'm going to say that it probably isn't going to make a big difference. But if it's something where obviously the bell is now out of shape, that more than likely, yes, it could make a difference. And the reason I say that is because when a bell is made, there are stresses and tensions actually put into that bell, and that's why it has the strength that it does, and it maintains the shape that it does, and also why it resonates the way that it does. So the issue is if the damage is such that it actually changes those tensions and stresses that are built into the bell, that then yes, it can have an effect on the way that the instrument then resonates, or is resonated, put it that way. After what we talked about earlier, it doesn't need to resonate to play, but it is being resonated. So yeah, I mean, you can have an instrument that is completely trashed, and I don't have it here anymore, where the bell is completely buckled, and you can take that out and it'll look good, and sometimes you can get lucky and the horn will play almost as well as it did. But a lot of the time, because that tension has been released and it's been brought back into shape, the tension isn't recreated the same way, unfortunately. And so, in this instance, the bell was replaced entirely because it wasn't a player after it had been repaired. So I hope that answered that question. It really depends on the dent as to how much of an influence it might have.
I'm asking on behalf of my 12-year-old grandson who's acquiring dents, it seems. He's young, but they're not severe dents, that's all.
Okay. What is the instrument that he's acquiring the dents on?
A trombone, but I don't know the brand.
Okay.
I've only seen it through Zoom.
Okay. If this is probably heresy to say it, but if it's a student Yamaha, I wouldn't worry about it.
Okay.
If it was a nicer instrument, I'd try and encourage him to maybe learn to look after the instrument better.
Yes.
Yeah, you know where I'm heading.
I know. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a rate of attrition thing, I think, with young kids for the most part.
I'm a middle school band director, and I can tell you the most important thing for trombone is, does the slide move? If the slide moves, we're good. Maybe by high school they'll learn how to take care of it.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm a college trombone teacher, and I'm just going to go ahead and agree with you on that. It still holds true. So,
yeah.
Actually, I had a question, and the last thing I want to do is turn this into like a graduate seminar on physics of propagated waveforms. But I do have a question, and some of it is kind of from like Christian Lindbergh's. I once saw him like speak live about all of the cool things he was doing with instrument design. So it came to me, and so I wrote this little visual graphic of a wave vibrating.
Okay.
Most of us already know that like these points in time are called the nodes, where the amount of vibration that's actually happening kind of goes down to zero, and then it kind of comes back out. And the crest of the wave is where like there's a maximal level of vibration.
Yeah.
And what that would mean is that for any given note, that note has a certain wavelength of vibration, which means the nodes and the crests are going to kind of land at different places along the journey in terms of the travel that it takes throughout the metal.
Yep.
So one could conceivably hypothesize that certain notes where the nodes or the crests land in certain spots in the instrument where this brace happens to be placed, or where this metal happens to change, or where this thickness is, or whatever. Therefore, what is how much do you have to deal with, or what is the possibility of, or what do you consider, how much do you value or worry about dead notes on an instrument, like a certain length of slide for a certain note, and it just has a dead sound? I know that we're supposed to use alternate positions, and we're supposed to learn our alternate positions so we can play notes in multiple places, but some of them don't sound the same. And I don't think it's just a matter of the length of tube. I think sometimes it's more along the lines of where those wavelengths are landing within the metal. Like sometimes I might play like a low C, for example, on double trigger 4 for bass trombone.
Yep.
But if I crank my F out to E, and that shifts the place where that C is, it changes where those maybe nodes and crests land on the metal, and therefore
Right.
changes the quality of sound a little bit. How much do you worry about this, or how much of your mathing has gone into figuring out where this happens? Or is it just kind of like, it's going to happen because there's so many different notes and so many different lengths, you can't really worry about it? I just wanted to know if you have put any thought into that, because I have been very intrigued by that.
Yes, there was a lot of thought that went into that. Like I said, initially designing the horns, it involved a calculator. There's no escaping it. However, having said that, math is certainly a part of designing an instrument, but there are aspects of an instrument that I don't have control over, and some of those aspects are actually the player. So that's something that you may not necessarily be able to take into account until you know how the player plays. Because oral cavity, the size of your mouth is actually a part of the instrument that's being played. So that's something that's a difficult question to answer in that regard, that you can take into account the math for the mouthpiece out, but there is also the math from the mouthpiece back, which does come into play, and that's something that you can't really take account of sometimes, but because that does change the math from the mouthpiece out to some extent. It's not all black and white. That's a difficult question to answer, actually, to some extent.
Well, that's okay. That's kind of my calling card. I like to do that to people, apparently. I think in the vocal tradition, where we can talk about like the development of the bel canto system, where you're not just a tenor, you're a Wagnerian tenor.
Right.
Type of resonance that your body has, and that a certain voice sound, the type that you have. And I think maybe trombones, we're kind of starting to bud in this American sound, European sound, and we're starting to kind of fracture these different maybe words that we can use to describe the sounds. But I think you're right in saying that what the player brings to the situation will significantly affect any math that you're going to do from there on out. And so they're really not to get all Harry Potter on it, but like the instrument and the person, there's kind of this symbiotic connection that really just needs to be found for that magical combination.
Yes.
And I think many of us have felt that with certain instruments that we've played and just really fell in love with. But how do you, so to take the question in a slightly different tack,
okay,
if you have people that come to you with opinions on things they want to like put together and things they want to make, like, have you kind of found certain combinations that just seem to make the magic happen more often and are better to go with? And so sometimes combinations that somebody brings to you, you're like, yeah, I don't know if that's going to work out,
Yes.
What, how have you kind of, I'm not trying to say like how many combinations do you have, but can you describe maybe a couple of those that you have found to really just be kind of a magical thing?
Well, to answer your question about if somebody was to come to me with a laundry list of what they would like to have in an instrument, if it looks to my eye to be something that it's questionable as to whether it's going to work or not, I would say to them, look, this is what I would suggest. Try it. And then if you want to change something, we can change something. Right? So I would rather go from the perspective of a known quantity, of a combination of components that I feel will work well. And then if they still want to change something, because there have been instances where somebody has said, I'd like to try this, 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 and this. And I've said, okay, let's backtrack a bit and try this to start with. And it's ended up that's worked just fine for them. They played it and said, yeah, this is fabulous. I don't want to change a thing.
I mean, that's essentially what you did for me when I was like, hey, I want, red brass bell, tuning in slide, yellow slide, single bore, blah, blah, blah. And you were like, let me send you my green hoe, and why don't you just play that for a couple weeks and get back to me on it. And I felt good about it, but
yeah. Well, I would much rather have somebody end up with an instrument that they're happy to play, as opposed to have to refund them. If I can offer an instrument for somebody to play and see if they like it or not, as opposed to make something that's a one-off and have them play it and go, oh man, I don't like this at all, and have to refund them. I hate having to refund somebody. Fortunately, it hasn't had to happen very much. I think one occasion. Yeah, that sucks. So does that answer the question that there are certain combinations that I believe work well together, that there is a balance to be found within the overall instrument, that for a lot of players that will work really, really well. And you can then swap out the hand slide crook, or to a different material or a different bore of the hand slide crook, and you can get into the tuning slide crook or the valve section parts or stuff like that. But that I much rather approach it from the perspective of try something that I feel works well, and we can develop from there, as opposed to starting way out in left field and ending up with something that is always going to be an abomination.
Well, there was an interesting TED talk that a man did about, he ended up spending a lot of time talking about his jeans. He has a pair of jeans, and he talked about a pair of jeans that he had in the 60s. And basically his story was, he had this pair of jeans in the 60s. Everybody that had jeans in the 60s, they fit horribly. There's it's a very small number of variables that are put into the size, of making the jeans. And you eventually get used to it. And so you eventually, that pair of jeans just becomes the pair of jeans that fits you, because the denim kind of stretches and, morphs to you.
Right.
And nowadays there's 30,000 different slight variations to sizes of jeans that you can get, and nobody's happy, and so it was interesting to kind of, put that kind of a comparison to, you could probably spend the rest of your life tweaking the same instrument and
absolutely
chasing yourself around,
Yes. Yeah. Rightly or wrongly, like I said earlier, I have this idea as to what a great American orchestral trombone is, and that's what I'm pursuing. There is a saying about being, I perhaps should not say this, but there is a saying about being a gentleman, that there are those who can and choose not to, right? That perhaps for some musicians, there are people who can and they perhaps shouldn't. That some of us are capable of doing extraordinary things, but those extraordinary things aren't necessarily called for in what we do as an orchestral trombone player. Do you get where I'm heading? That talking about trombone players who get the hand, that we can play incredibly loudly, but there are times where it's perhaps not really applicable, and understanding when it is applicable and when it's not. I tend to think that the same thing goes for instrument design and construction, that there are things that you can do that can allow somebody to do something awesome. But how applicable is it to what we do from day to day? I mean, if that's what you do, if that's your bag and how you make your living, then absolutely. But for the vast majority of us, that's not the case. So yeah, that's kind of what influences me as an instrument manufacturer too. That yes, I can make something for that person who is out in left field, but for 99% of us, that's not the case, for better or worse. Does that help? Yeah, I didn't mean to sound disparaging in that, but yeah, I mean, we all know those people. To get back onto safer ground, Dominic, you held up a German trombone earlier.
Yeah, I mean,
What is that?
That's my Glasel.
Ah,
It's Tim Dowling's old Glasel.
well, I'm still going to say it. You ratbag.
So I've got my Glasel. I play on an alto Glasel and the Model Kun.
Wow.
I actually bought that in January, February.
Okay.
So it's had
Wow.
one rehearsal in the orchestra.
Wow. You lucky rotten.
I mean,
So how's it play? Tell me about what's it like? Is it an older one or is it?
It's 1980s.
Okay.
But it's a
I'm not
Model
familiar with
Kun,
it.
so it's sort of the old style German.
Yeah, very, very traditional in design.
Yeah, so super light. It's like the thinnest bell ever made. It's pure tin. Yeah, like, I mean, the interesting things, like if you put a rubber stopper on the end of the slide, it just dies. It's Tim Dowling, who had this before. He actually had the snakes off. We tried it with it without, and it needs them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just a horn that just, you just feel that it's just a wall of sound that's not harsh. It's big, not harsh. Every dynamic range is just beautiful.
Yeah.
You're all over the slide. No tone is where it should be.
Yes. Yes. Unfortunately, when I visited Herr Glasel's shop, that was back in, when was that? 96, I think it was. That was before my real interest in German instruments. So, you know, I would have had the opportunity to buy instruments at that time, but it really was, the point was over my head at the time. But yeah, that's something that I'm very much interested in now too. And I have an old Scherzer in my possession at the present time, which is giving me some clues, and a Krusper as well, which
can be amazing or complete dogs. I
played this one's pretty spectacular.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Scherzer is it's nice. It's got the characteristics that a German instrument should have, but there are some notes on it which are just terrible. But they are the influence for me at present. That's something that, you know, I've wanted to do for a long time, is actually make a German instrument, or at least, well, it's not a German instrument because it's being made in Jackson, Wisconsin, but a German styled instrument. So yeah, that's.
Yeah, we've had a lot of discussions. I was actually just thinking when we're talking about straight horns, I spent a lot of time. That's my gooseneck that I have on my green hoe.
Yep.
Oh, wow.
We actually spent a lot of time developing that gooseneck, a day of just small variations.
Right.
Because it's 10% of the horn when you're thinking about it. So the off-the-shelf goosenecks might not work on the horn you have, I think.
Right.
And it was for us putting that counterweight onto the gooseneck just made the horn play like I wanted to play, like my section were used to it playing, because when you're sitting in a section every day, you don't want them suddenly, you turn up on a pea shooter one day and a bass trombone the next day.
Right.
When the repertoire, of course, calls for changes, you can. But a horn that sounds the same and responds only positively without having any negatives. And that was actually a lot of work. Well, couple of days work to find exactly how to fit that onto the horn the way it worked.
Right. So it's interesting though, you've basically introduced weight similar to a valve.
Exactly. That is extremely heavy.
Yeah.
But placed so when the horn comes up, it swings into playing position.
Right.
So the center of balance on the horn isn't around the valve, but behind.
Yeah.
And that's why I play a straight. The biggest reason I play a straight horn is because I had back issues, and I was stretching for my horn to get it off the stand.
Right.
Throwing my back out.
Right.
And so especially when you're playing in an opera where you're every 10 minutes you're off the stand, on the stand, off the stand, on the stand for 4 hours.
Yeah.
Whereas in a symphony, you're 20 minutes stock still. That was the reason for playing the straight horn. Right. I mean, obviously this is a straight horn because it was built this way.
Yeah.
And yeah, that took us a bit of work to find where to put that weight. And I mean, a normal counterweight that you screw on, but then you have your tuning slide with a counterweight. When you put your valve back on, it's too heavy.
Right.
So, and he put his name on it in gigantic letters. I get a phone call. It's like, am I allowed to put my name on it? And I said, yeah, I sure engrave it somewhere. And it's the most gigantic advertisement ever made.
Excellent.
You're like a NASCAR billboard there.
Yeah, it's gigantic.
Matthew, do you make alto trombones?
I do, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
And I if I do say so myself, I'm very happy with them. I've sold a number of them now, but I've still got the original proof of concept instrument here, which I played the Haydn Creation on a little while ago, and I'm very happy to say that I was the hindrance, not the instrument. I'm very happy with them. They play very well. And I think actually there's a couple of short videos of me play testing a couple of them on the M&W Facebook page. If you want to have a look and find those videos.
Are they kind of like German inspired, or some? Where does this sort of inspiration behind them? I guess the reason I ask is that I have a Con alto that I'm actually not.
Okay.
It's not an L. It's not one of the older ones. It's more newer ones, and it's got the B flat valve. And I'm not really. I made it work for a long time, but it's not my first choice. I played a Chromat alto when I was in Europe, which I loved. So I'm kind of looking for something. Guess kind of like along that lines, because alto is going to come up really on the romantic stuff, really, for principal trombones. So going in that direction makes sense to me, at least.
Yeah. Well, the same variations that I offer on the other instruments apply to the alto. So 1-piece or 2-piece bells, different materials, red, gold, yellow. We could do nickel silver or sterling silver as well, if that was of interest, if somebody, the money for a sterling bell. But that's the predominant choice, is the bell construction. The weight of the bell less so. Unless you wanted to go for a German style bell, which I could do with that very thin material with a krantz. That's another thing that's going to be coming out too, hopefully not too far in the future. But again, it really depends on, there are other considerations as to whether it's a German instrument or an American instrument. And, the slide bore, for example, the horns that I've built so far have been 0.5 top and bottom. But the bell flare itself is not perhaps as large as some of the altos out there. So that combination of the slightly larger slide bore but smaller bell tends to give a slightly more American type response. And the idea with those horns was so that they would work with a section of American instruments, because that's predominantly what American trombone players are going to do, is be playing in a section of American trombones. But as I say, again, they could be influenced in certain directions if somebody was looking to go that way.
That's very interesting. Cool, thanks. I'm glad you're doing that, because I don't know, I've often struggling with just alto, like, because it's sort of like, it's cool. No, thanks.
You're welcome.
Could I just ask on altos there, like the con is, or the bark, which for me are just E flat tenors. I found I playing on the glass, and what I find between the American and the Germans is for me, what it lies is a lot in the tuning slide.
Right.
And when I go back to Australia and I take my Glasl alto, the tenor doesn't leave Germany,
Right.
is I can't get it down to 440. Because I guess it's to do with the conical bore of it. I don't have my alto with me, but where the tuning slide, they barely ever move because but it's about 10 centimeters long, the entire tuning slide. Oh,
Right.
this long, the tuning slide before you're done.
Yeah.
And often on my alto, I have no seventh position. And I've talked about this with a few instrument manufacturers, and they just said that's the old German style doesn't have that because of the way the tuning slides are built. Is that something that makes the sound, or?
Well, the big challenge with alto trombones is making, ideally, that old German style instrument. That is one ideal. The other ideal actually would be like the Bach 39. It's got a lot of things are right about that horn. The problem with it is that the slide bore is too small, to be able to really work with modern American large bore tenors. And that's why they're not terribly well accepted. So that's why these horns that I'm making, I use a larger bore slide, but the bell is perhaps not as large as some of the German makers, right? And traditional German instruments have a very small slide, but a larger bell as the counter, if that makes sense. Whereas traditional American instruments have a larger bore slide with a smaller bell. So it's finding that correct balance. But to talk about tuning slide design, the hardest thing for an alto, basically the smaller that you get in an instrument, the more critical the tapers become. On a contrabass trombone, you can get away with a heck of a lot of discrepancies in the bore shape, right? Because the distance between first and second position, is this big. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but you've got a lot more wiggle room, with things on a contrabass. You've got a little bit less wiggle room on a B flat. You've got a lot less wiggle room on an E flat alto, even less wiggle room on a B flat soprano, with getting shapes right. And as Jason was talking about earlier, with the nodal points and the way that whoops, I dropped the microphone. With the way that the sound wave interacts with the inside of the instrument, where those nodal points lie, you've got a lot less wiggle room on an alto than you do on a tenor, than you do on a contrabass. So the tuning slide is one of those critical areas that can create issues if it's not done correctly. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I just think it's coming from two different sort of orchestral worlds, the